John Keel published Strange Creatures from Time and Space in 1970 after spending several years traveling across the United States, collecting reports of two categories of phenomena that the research communities of the time treated as entirely separate. The first was UFO sightings, structured objects in the sky, reported by credible witnesses, behaving in ways conventional aircraft do not. The second was large bipedal creature sightings, what the press was beginning to call Bigfoot, though the reports Keel was collecting came from across the country in different terrain types and involved descriptions that varied in ways suggesting they were not all describing the same animal or the same kind of experience. Keel was looking at both sets of reports simultaneously, and what he noticed was that they clustered in the same specific counties during the same specific time periods, not broadly in the same regions, in the same places, in the same weeks. His 1970 book documented this correlation and proposed a theoretical framework to explain it, what he called the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the idea that the phenomena were not extraterrestrial visitors, but something that had always been present on Earth, something that manifested in different forms depending on circumstances and context. Keel's theoretical framework was speculative and controversial, and it remains so. His core observational finding, the geographic and temporal co-location of the two categories of phenomena, was real and has been independently confirmed by subsequent researchers working from different data sets. This episode examines the overlap evidence, what it actually shows, what it might mean, and what it does not establish. Stan Gordon has been documenting unusual phenomena in Pennsylvania since the 1960s, and his work on the 1973 Pennsylvania flap represents the most detailed historical case study of the overlap pattern. In the fall of 1973, Pennsylvania experienced a concentrated period of elevated unusual activity across multiple categories. UFO reports increased sharply statewide. Simultaneously, reports of large unknown creatures, bipedal, dark, described in terms consistent with what Bigfoot researchers were documenting in the Pacific Northwest, increased in the same counties where the UFO reports were concentrated. Gordon collected reports from witnesses across the state, conducting field interviews and maintaining detailed case files. His documentation from this period spans hundreds of individual reports. The cases where both categories appeared in the same location within the same time window were the most significant findings. The most specific single case occurred in October 1973 in Fayette County, in the southwestern corner of the state near the West Virginia border. Two witnesses, Stephen Pulaski, who owned the farm where the events occurred, and his younger companions, reported observing a luminous sphere, approximately 100 feet in diameter, descend into a field approximately 150 yards from their position. When they approached, they found two large white figures in the field near where the sphere had landed. The figures were described as approximately 8 feet tall, covered in white hair or fur, making a whimpering sound. Pulaski fired 3 shots at the figures with a rifle. They appeared unaffected. The sphere disappeared. The figures walked into the tree line. Pulaski subsequently fell unconscious at the scene and was found in an apparently cataleptic state by his companions. He recovered within minutes, but described the experience afterward as unlike anything he had previously undergone. Gordon interviewed Pulaski and the witnesses separately on multiple occasions. Their accounts were consistent in the core details. Gordon found no evidence of fabrication and no apparent motivation for false reporting. What the Fayette County case documents is temporal and spatial co-location of phenomena from both categories within a single event sequence, the same location, the same night, observed by multiple witnesses simultaneously. Gordon's broader documentation from the 1973 flap includes dozens of additional cases from the same period showing the two categories of report concentrated in the same western Pennsylvania counties. The concentration is specific enough that Keel's general observation about co-location finds its most detailed regional confirmation in Gordon's 1973 Pennsylvania work. The geographic specificity of the overlap is one of its more interesting characteristics because it argues against simple reporting bias explanations. If the correlation between elevated UAP report frequency and elevated creature encounter frequency simply reflected shared rural setting, both phenomena reported more often in isolated areas with fewer alternative explanations, the overlap would distribute broadly across rural terrain. It would not concentrate at the county level or at the level of specific drainages and geological configurations. The available evidence suggests the concentration is finer than pure rural versus urban distribution would predict. In the 1973 Pennsylvania flap, the concentration was specifically in the southwestern counties, Fayette, Washington, Westmoreland, and Armstrong, while other equally rural Pennsylvania counties showed much lower rates of both categories. Gordon documented this geographic specificity and noted that the southwestern Pennsylvania counties share specific terrain characteristics. The Monongahela River drainage, specific geological formations in the Appalachian foothills, and proximity to major fault systems. Whether those terrain characteristics are causally relevant to the co-location, or whether the co-location reflects some other factor specific to that region, is not established by the available evidence. What is established is that the co-location is geographically specific rather than broadly distributed, which is more consistent with terrain-based explanations than with pure reporting bias explanations. Researcher Don Worley spent decades specifically documenting the overlap between UAP activity and Bigfoot-type creature reports across the Midwest and Upper South. His work, published in various forms in the 1970s and 1980s, focused particularly on Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, states with both elevated creature encounter frequencies and consistent UAP activity. Worley's methodology was primarily interview-based. He maintained case files on hundreds of individual reports and cross-referenced them geographically. His finding was consistent with Keel's and with Gordon's Pennsylvania documentation. The two categories of report concentrated in the same specific areas rather than distributing independently across the regions he examined. He identified specific Indiana counties, Sullivan, Knox, Daviess, as consistent high-activity areas for both categories over extended periods. His interviews with witnesses in these areas included multiple cases of witnesses who had experienced both categories of phenomenon on their own property or in their immediate area, sometimes in the same general time period. Worley's work has the limitations of most anomalous phenomena research from that era: inconsistent case documentation standards, reliance on self-selected witnesses, absence of systematic controls. Its value is primarily as a documented pattern across a large number of cases rather than as a set of individually conclusive reports. Combined with Keel's broader observations and Gordon's more detailed Pennsylvania documentation, Worley's Midwest work adds geographic breadth to the overlap picture. The pattern appears consistently across different regions, documented by different researchers using different methodologies. The geological context of the Pennsylvania overlap zone is worth examining because it connects to the broader geophysical hypothesis discussed in the Uinta Basin episode. Western Pennsylvania sits on the Appalachian Plateau, underlain by sedimentary formations including significant deposits of sandstone, shale, and coal measures. The southwestern counties where the 1973 activity concentrated sit near the contact zone between different geological formations, an area where different rock types meet and where the structural complexity of the terrain is elevated relative to adjacent areas. The Monongahela River drainage that defines much of the southwestern Pennsylvania geography cuts through these formations, creating water convergence zones and terrain configurations that appear repeatedly in high-activity areas documented throughout this series. Penn State geologist William Greenberg published a study in 1978 examining the relationship between coal mine subsidence, the settling and fracturing of the ground above mined-out coal seams, and unusual light phenomena reports in western Pennsylvania coal country. His finding was that a significant proportion of the unusual light reports in the region could be associated with areas of active subsidence, where ground fracturing releases gases and creates conditions for localized electrical phenomena. The Greenberg study is specific to light phenomena and does not address creature reports, but it provides a physically grounded partial explanation for one category of the Pennsylvania overlap, and it grounds the Pennsylvania pattern in specific geological processes rather than leaving it entirely unexplained. The coal seam geology of southwestern Pennsylvania is not present in most other high overlap areas, suggesting that if geological factors are relevant to the overlap, the specific mechanisms may vary by region, even if the general pattern of geological complexity producing elevated activity holds across locations. The research of Ted Blucher, a serious UFO researcher who worked with J. Allen Hynek at the Center for UFO Studies in the 1970s, produced one of the earliest systematic analyses of what he called humanoid cases, UAP encounters that also involved observation of unusual entities. Blucher compiled hundreds of cases from the global literature and documented them in a catalogue published in 1979. His geographic analysis of the North American cases found patterns consistent with what Keel and Gordon had observed independently. Concentration in specific regions that also showed elevated conventional UAP activity. Blucher was careful to distinguish between different categories of humanoid report: cases where entities were observed near or emerging from structured craft, cases where entities appeared without associated craft, and cases where the relationship between entities and any aerial phenomena was unclear. His catalogue remains a significant reference document for the overlap question because it represents systematic compilation rather than selective case reporting. The geographic patterns he identified from the full catalogue are more meaningful than patterns drawn from selected dramatic cases. The key question the overlap evidence raises: what, if anything, connects UAP phenomena and unusual creature encounters beyond geographic co-location, has been addressed by different researchers in incompatible ways, and the honest engagement with the material requires being clear about what each framework can and cannot establish. Jacques Vallée's interdimensional hypothesis proposes that both categories of phenomena are expressions of a single underlying reality that interacts with the physical world in ways that produce different apparent manifestations depending on context. His books, Passport to Magonia, The Invisible College, and Dimensions, develop this framework in detail. Vallée draws on folklore, historical accounts of entity encounters going back centuries, and the modern UAP and creature report record to argue for a consistent underlying phenomenon expressed in culturally variable forms. Vallée's framework is intellectually serious and grounded in a genuine breadth of evidence. It is also unfalsifiable in its current form. The hypothesis that phenomena are interdimensional in origin cannot be tested against available evidence in ways that would definitively confirm or refute it. That does not make it wrong. It means it is a framework for organizing observations rather than a testable scientific hypothesis in the conventional sense. The shared geophysical enabling conditions hypothesis, that specific geological and electromagnetic characteristics of certain locations facilitate both categories of phenomena for independent reasons, is more physically grounded and, in principle, more testable. If the overlap concentrates in areas with specific geological characteristics, that prediction can be assessed against geophysical maps. The preliminary evidence from the Pennsylvania and Uinta Basin cases is consistent with this prediction, though systematic testing has not been conducted. The reporting bias hypothesis, that both phenomena are reported more frequently in culturally receptive rural environments, is the most conservative and, in some respects, the hardest to fully rule out. Rural isolation, cultural openness to unusual experiences, and limited alternative explanations may inflate apparent overlap rates. The geographic specificity of the documented patterns within rural areas is the strongest argument against this explanation being the primary driver, but it cannot be entirely excluded. All three frameworks are consistent with the documented patterns. The available evidence does not establish any of them over the others. The indigenous frameworks discussed earlier in this series, the Lakota, Anishinaabe, Cherokee, and Ute traditions, do not organize the phenomena the way Western research communities do. They do not have separate categories for aerial phenomena and terrestrial beings. The beings they describe occupy a relationship to the human world that is not defined by where they appear. They cross between the human world and whatever exists alongside it. They can appear in multiple ways. The specific form of appearance is not what defines their category. This organizational framework has obvious implications for the overlap question. If the traditional knowledge that has accumulated over centuries of direct experience with these phenomena does not separate aerial and terrestrial manifestations into different categories, that is worth noting as evidence that the categorical separation imposed by modern Western research may not reflect how the phenomena actually organize. This is not proof that the phenomena share a common source. It is evidence that people with the most sustained direct experience of them did not find the categorical distinction useful or accurate. That is a meaningful data point, held appropriately as one input among several rather than as definitive resolution. The government's classified programs and their relationship to the overlap question is an area where the evidence is thinner than the popular discussion suggests. Luis Elizondo described the ATIP program as having collected reports from military personnel that were not strictly aerial, ground-level encounters in the vicinity of documented UAP activity areas. Former AATIP contractor James Lakatsky has described in his book Skinwalker Ranch, The Invasion of Area X, the program's broader interest in what he calls phenomenon that encompassed more than aerial objects. These accounts suggest the classified programs recognize the overlap pattern, that they were collecting data on both aerial and non-aerial unusual phenomena from the same geographic areas. Whether this reflected institutional recognition of a genuine connection or simply practical collection of all unusual reports from high-activity locations cannot be determined from the available accounts. The congressional testimony of 2023 did not address the overlap directly. Grush's testimony focused on craft and biological materials of non-human origin, not on the relationship between aerial and terrestrial encounter phenomena. The classified record may contain relevant findings about the overlap. That is a reasonable inference from what has been disclosed. What those findings are, if they exist, is not known from outside the classification. The honest summary of what the overlap evidence shows is worth stating directly before this episode closes. The geographic and temporal co-location of UAP reports and unusual creature encounter reports is a real pattern, documented by multiple independent researchers across different regions and different time periods. Keel identified it in the 1960s. Gordon documented it in specific detail in 1973 Pennsylvania. Worley confirmed it across the Midwest. Blucher's humanoid catalog shows consistent geographic patterns. The pattern is not a single researcher's artifact. The explanation for the pattern is genuinely uncertain. Shared geophysical enabling conditions, a common source with multiple manifestations, reporting bias effects specific to certain communities, or some combination of these factors are all consistent with the documented patterns. The geological angle, specific terrain characteristics creating conditions for both categories of unusual phenomena, is the most physically testable explanation and deserves more systematic investigation than it has received. The Pennsylvania coal seam work by Greenberg, the Hessdalen geological research, and the Uinta Basin electromagnetic data all point in the same direction without establishing a causal mechanism. The traditional knowledge frameworks that do not separate aerial and terrestrial phenomena suggest the categorical separation may not reflect how the phenomena actually organize. That is an observation worth taking seriously without treating it as proof of specific theoretical claims. The classified programs appear to have recognized the overlap and collected data accordingly. What they concluded from that data is not in the public record. The research required to move from documented pattern to established explanation has not been conducted. The institutional frameworks that would support that research remain largely unengaged with the subject. The overlap is real. The explanation remains open. The investigation continues. That is what the evidence shows. The Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington state represents one of the most sustained and geographically specific overlap documentations in the American record. Beginning in the early 1970s and continuing through the 1980s, the Yakima area produced concentrated reports of both unusual aerial lights and large creature encounters. The documentation effort was led primarily by Greg Long, a Washington state researcher who spent years conducting field interviews in the area. Long's work, published in his 1990 book, Examining the Earthlight Theory, focused initially on the aerial phenomena and expanded to include creature reports when his fieldwork made the collocation pattern impossible to ignore. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, tribal members, ranchers, and residents of the surrounding communities, and compiled case files with geographic coordinates, dates, and witness details. What he found: the aerial phenomena reports concentrated in specific sections of the reservation, particularly the mountainous terrain to the west and the river drainage areas to the east. The creature encounter reports concentrated in the same sections. Witnesses who reported one category of experience frequently lived in areas where both categories were reported by their neighbors. The Yakima Reservation sits on basalt formations, volcanic rock with specific electromagnetic properties different from the sedimentary geology of Pennsylvania, but producing similar anomalous field characteristics in surveys. The Columbia River system creates convergence zones consistent with the hydrological pattern seen elsewhere. Long's investigation also documented the traditional knowledge of Yakama Nation members, who described both categories of phenomena as known features of their landscape. The aerial lights were recognized as significant. The large beings were known and had specific names and protocols associated with them in traditional knowledge. Long was careful to distinguish between what witnesses reported and what he could verify independently. His documentation of the geographic pattern is the most systematic produced for the Yakima area and remains the primary reference for that location. The Ohio Valley has produced consistent creature encounter reports since at least the 1960s, and the geographic overlap with UAP activity in the region has been noted by multiple independent researchers. The Ohio Valley sits at a geological transition zone, the edge of the Appalachian Plateau, meeting the interior plains. With a complex of rock formations, river systems, and terrain features that researchers have identified as consistent with high-activity areas elsewhere. Researcher Ron Schaffner compiled Ohio creature encounter reports systematically through the 1980s and 1990s. His database, while not publicly available in full, has been referenced by other researchers who accessed it for comparative analysis. The geographic distribution of his Ohio cases showed concentration in specific river drainage areas consistent with the pattern Keel documented nationally. The Ohio River itself and its major tributaries, the Scioto, the Muskingum, the Hocking, define drainage patterns that Schaffner's geographic analysis identified as corridor zones for elevated activity frequency. These corridors correspond to terrain features, valley floors with specific geological exposure, convergence points where tributaries meet the main river, areas of geological complexity where different formation types are in contact. Whether the river corridors are causally relevant to the encounter patterns or simply correlate with other factors, population distribution along waterways, historical land use patterns, specific vegetation types is not established by the geographic analysis alone. The documented evidence from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the fall of 1974 provides a military context for the overlap that is distinct from the civilian witness reports that dominate most documentation. Multiple soldiers stationed at Fort Bragg filed reports of unusual sightings during a period of several weeks in the fall of 1974. The reports included structured aerial objects observed over the base perimeter and surrounding forest areas, and at least 2 reports of large unidentified figures observed near the tree line adjacent to training areas. The military reports were processed through standard incident reporting channels and were subsequently classified. Their existence is known from the accounts of individuals who filed them and from references in documents obtained through FOIA requests years later, but the specific content of the reports remains in the classified record. The Fort Bragg case is relevant not because it is particularly well documented, it is not, but because it represents a military context where both categories of unusual report were generated within the same time period at the same installation, and where the institutional response was classification rather than investigation. This pattern, military encounter reports classified rather than investigated, is consistent with the broader institutional behavior documented in the previous episodes and suggests the overlap pattern may appear in the military encounter record with greater frequency than the public record reveals. The research of Don Schmitt and Kevin Randall, primarily known for their work on the Roswell incident, produced a geographically relevant finding in their broader survey of UAP crash retrieval claims. In their 1994 book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, and subsequent work, Schmitt and Randall noted that a disproportionate number of alleged UAP crash or landing cases where physical material was reportedly recovered or where objects appeared to make ground contact, clustered in areas that also showed elevated creature encounter frequencies. Their primary focus was on the crash retrieval claims, and their documentation of the creature encounter overlap was secondary to that focus, but the observation was specific. The geographic concentration of both categories of report in the same areas was consistent enough to note as a pattern worthy of further examination. Schmitt and Randall's work has its own credibility issues in the Roswell-specific research, where their methods have been disputed. But the broader geographic observation about the co-location of physical trace cases and creature encounter reports is independent of their Roswell-specific claims and is consistent with what other researchers documented from different starting points. The comparative geography of major overlap zones identified across the research literature shows consistent terrain characteristics that are worth documenting specifically. The southwestern Pennsylvania counties, documented by Gordon in 1973, sit on the Appalachian Plateau at the edge of the Pittsburgh Plateau section, with coal measures, sandstone formations, and the Monongahela River drainage. Elevations range from approximately 800 to 2,000 feet. The terrain is hilly and heavily forested in the areas outside the industrial river valleys. The Yakima Reservation area, documented by Long, sits on Columbia River Plateau basalt with mountain terrain to the west and river drainage to the east. Elevations range from valley floor at approximately 800 feet to mountain ridges above 7,000 feet. The transition between the plateau basalt and the Cascade Mountain formations creates geological complexity. The Uinta Basin, documented in the previous episode, sits at elevations of 4,500 to 6,000 feet on the floor, with the Uinta Mountains reaching above 13,000 feet to the north. The geological complexity described in that episode, piezoelectric minerals, electromagnetic anomalies, characterizes the basin. The Ohio Valley Corridor sits at lower elevations, 500 to 1,000 feet, but at the geological transition zone between the Appalachian Plateau and the interior plains, where different rock formations are in contact. What these zones share: geological complexity at or near formation boundaries or transition zones, water convergence and drainage patterns that create terrain variety, mixed elevation profiles, and distance from major population centers that reduces conventional explanations for unusual reports. What they do not uniformly share: specific rock types, specific elevation ranges, specific climate conditions. The specific geological characteristics vary. The general character of geological complexity at transition zones is consistent. Whether geological complexity at transition zones is the relevant variable, or whether it correlates with some other factor that is the actual relevant variable, is not established by the geographic pattern alone. The strongest argument for taking the overlap seriously as a genuine research question rather than a statistical artifact of reporting patterns comes from the cases where both categories of phenomena appear in the same event sequence. The 1973 Fayette County case, documented by Gordon, is one example. The sphere and the creatures observed simultaneously by the same witnesses at the same location. There are others. In August 1972, in Rochdale, Indiana, a family reported over several nights both aerial lights over their property and large creature encounters near the tree line. Multiple family members independently witnessed both categories. Researcher Don Worley investigated the case and documented it in detail. The family had no apparent motivation to fabricate, and Worley found their accounts consistent across separate interviews. In October 1973, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, the same general region and period as the Fayette County case, a witness reported observing two creatures near a glowing sphere that had landed in a field. He approached close enough to observe the creatures in detail before they and the sphere departed. Gordon investigated and documented this case as well. In June 1974, in Liberty, Kentucky, multiple witnesses over several nights reported both aerial lights and large dark figures near the perimeter of a farm property. The witnesses included adults and teenagers, whose accounts were collected by area researcher Bob Teets and found to be internally consistent. These cases do not prove a common source for both categories of phenomena. They document witnesses observing both categories in close temporal and spatial proximity, sometimes in the same event sequence, sometimes within days at the same location. That is specific observational evidence that the phenomena, whatever their ultimate nature, can appear together in ways that reporting bias explanations do not easily account for. Before closing this episode, a note on what the overlap evidence does not establish, because this is a subject where overclaiming is easy and common. The overlap does not establish that UFOs and Bigfoot-type creatures are the same phenomenon. It establishes that their reports co-locate geographically and temporally. Co-location is consistent with a common source, but is also consistent with shared enabling conditions and other explanations. The overlap does not establish that either category of phenomenon is non-human in origin. The phenomena in both categories are documented as genuinely anomalous, not explained by conventional frameworks. What they are is not established. The overlap does not establish that the government's classified programs have identified a common source and are concealing it. The classified programs appear to have collected data on both categories in the same locations. What they concluded from that data is not known. The overlap does not establish that indigenous traditional frameworks that do not separate the categories are correct. Those frameworks represent accumulated experience and deserve serious engagement. They are not proof of any specific theoretical claim. What the overlap does establish is that the categorical separation between UAP research and creature encounter research, which has organized the field for decades, may not reflect how the phenomena actually organize. That the evidence for co-location is strong enough that any adequate explanation for either category needs to account for why the other category appears in the same places at the same times. That is a specific, meaningful constraint on what adequate explanations would look like. It has not been adequately addressed by either research community. The investigation that would address it requires treating the overlap as a genuine research question rather than as a curiosity at the margins of two separate fields. That investigation remains to be conducted. The research record on the overlap question is worth summarizing honestly before this episode ends. Keel's original 1970 observation was real but methodologically limited, based on his own collected reports rather than systematic database analysis. Gordon's 1973 Pennsylvania documentation is the most specific and best evidenced historical case study, with geographic concentration documented across hundreds of cases from the same period. Long's Yakima work adds geographic breadth. Worley's Midwest documentation adds further breadth. Blucher's humanoid catalog provides systematic compilation across the broader North American record. Together, these represent a genuine pattern, not the artifact of one researcher's collection, not a regional quirk, but a consistent finding across independent documentation efforts in different regions over several decades. The pattern is real enough to take seriously as a research question. The explanation for the pattern is genuinely open. The geological transition zone hypothesis is the most physically testable and the most consistent with the comparative geography of documented overlap zones. It deserves systematic investigation against geophysical baseline data. That investigation has not been conducted. The cases where both categories appear in the same event sequence, Fayette County, 1973, Rochdale, 1972, Uniontown, 1973, are the strongest individual evidence that the co-location is not purely statistical. They are witness testimony cases with the limitations that implies. They are also the kind of evidence that serious investigation, rather than institutional dismissal, would follow up on. The institutional dismissal has been the consistent response. The research continues at the margins. The overlap remains documented, unexplained, and under-investigated? That is the honest state of the question after more than 50 years of accumulated evidence.